Welcome to a special episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, I'm joined by Jessie Seeberg-Gordon, who is a participant in the Menzies Early Career Network. This network offers Australian university students a fantastic opportunity to engage with the history of the Menzies era, connect with like-minded peers and respected figures in the field of Australian political history. As part of their involvement in the program, our 2024 participants contributed to a special project, writing chapters for our upcoming book, Finding Menzies, A New Generation's Inspiration for Foreign Affairs, Social Policy and Political Thought. In today's episode, I'll be asking Jessie about the chapter he wrote for this book, The Enemy of My Enemy, Australia and the Sino-Soviet Split, 1959 to 64. So Jessie, great topic. Why did you choose this topic?
Thanks so much for having me, Georgina. It's a pleasure to be here. So my interest in this topic of Australian-Soviet relations very much stemmed from an honours project that I did here at the University of Melbourne back in 2020. What a year that was.
Yes.
To be a historian. And that honours project focused on the decision by the Whitlam government to recognise the Baltic annexation by the Soviet Union, which of course occurred during World War II. And he did so in 1974. And, you know, I guess you could say my interest in Australian foreign policy history very much grew out of my area of interest of the Cold War and the Baltic region and the Soviet Union especially. I was reading an English language history of Estonia, and I came across this reference to the Whitlam recognition. I had to sort of do a double take. I thought to myself, he did what? Why? It's just such a bizarre thing. And so this sent me down a rabbit hole of, looking at all this diplomatic correspondence between Australia and the Soviet Union in the 70s. And I started thinking to myself, well, traditional wisdom has it that the relationship between Canberra and the Kremlin was, pretty insubstantial, pretty surface level during the Cold War. But this Baltic recognition topic was so fascinating, and I thought to myself, if all this happened in this small period of 1974 to 1975, what else happened during the Cold War? Surely it can't all be, as boring as traditional wisdom tells us it is. I didn't buy that for a second, so I decided to seek my answers in the archives.
Fantastic. Well, can you talk a bit about why Australia did re-establish its diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union in that 1950s period? Obviously, we had the Petrov affair here in Australia, massive scandal, diplomatic scandal, of course, but also a political scandal, and has had ramifications for Australian domestic politics with the election just shortly after.
Yeah, of course. So I'm sure your listeners will be well aware of what happened with the Petrov affair in 1954. A senior diplomat in the Soviet embassy was essentially defected along with his wife, bringing with him details of espionage activities conducted by the Soviet embassy in Australia at the time. And it was a huge scandal at the time with real serious, ripple effect ramifications, not only for Australian intelligence communities, but also, the intelligence communities in London, in Washington, in Canada as well. And, it really upset Australians. And as a result, Cabinet was hesitant to re-establish relations with Moscow for quite some time after that during the 50s. And the Australian public was broadly behind them, much as some historians might have you believe that, Menzies was rooted in this sort of archaic anti-communist, prejudice or persona. Everyday Australians really wanted nothing to do with the Soviets at this time because they were so incensed at what had happened with the Petrov affair. So you have the Soviets approaching Canberra, I think as early as 1955, so 1 year after the Petrov affair, sending out its feelers saying, hey, let's let bygones be bygones, this whole thing is silly, we shouldn't let the actions of one madman, as they refer to Petrov, define our future relationship. Cabinet wanted nothing to do with it. They were very much happy with the lack of diplomatic presence as it was. Around the time of 1956, you have cabinet saying, maybe we should start to reconsider this position, and then boom, the Budapest revolution in Hungary happens, and Soviet tanks, crush the revolution, the anti-communist revolutionaries. It's making front page news here in Australia, and the last thing the Menzies government wants to do is touch Moscow with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
And then, a couple more years go by, and finally, sort of around late 1958 to 1959, Cabinet is starting to finally realise that maybe the pros of not having a relationship with Moscow are starting to be outweighed by the cons. The two issues at the forefront of their minds here were trade considerations. So that's exports of wheat and wool in particular, which had pretty much completely ceased during this period. And the other being frustration at the lack of Australian diplomatic presence in the Iron Curtain. I mean, we didn't have relations with any of the other Iron Curtain countries aside from the Soviet Union, and everything we were getting, information-wise from this part of the world was coming through the British Embassy. So there was very much a sense that, okay, we need Australian boots back on the ground here if we're going to play any meaningful role in geopolitics in the coming decades. And I should give a nod to Alan Gray, an Australian of Australia, a historian of Australian foreign policy, for writing a book chapter on this recently. My findings from the archives broadly accord with hers. So yeah, she's done some great work on this topic in particular.
Yeah. So we restore our relations finally, don't we, in 1959?
1959, yes.
And this really comes after a decision by China, obviously under CCP rule, that it was breaking with its Soviet alliance, and there'd also been the fall of Molotov as foreign minister of Russia, and of the Soviet Union, and he had obviously been heavily involved in that Petrov affair incident, particularly sending that letter of assurance.
The infamous letter to Evatt assuring
to Doc Evatt,
saying, it's all a provocation by those who want to derail the Australian-Soviet relationship.
Yeah.
Very famous.
Yeah. So, I mean, what were your findings on those two aspects? I guess the impact those two instances had on this re-establishment of the relationship.
So Molotov doesn't crop up too much. I mean, he's a spent political force by this time. Interestingly, he was actually offered the position of ambassador to Australia, but we rejected him on the grounds that he no longer had the trust of his government, which of course he didn't. I mean, he'd been unseated by Khrushchev and Khrushchev's allies by this point. But yeah, the Sino-Soviet one's an interesting one. So around the time that relations are re-established, so that's 1959 onwards, the Sino-Soviet split is starting to take place. The origins of this split are a matter of some debate amongst Cold War historians. Some people chalk it up to ideology. For others, it's much more a sort of realpolitik sense that Beijing and Moscow are essentially fighting over who gets to be the top communist dog, who is the leader of the international communist movement. But regardless, by this time, it's gradually becoming clear to the outside world that there's trouble in paradise with this formerly rock-solid relationship. Yeah. And, around the time, sort of 1963 to 1964, there's very much this developing sense in the Department of External Affairs, our foreign ministry at the time, that, hang on, maybe we can use this to our advantage somehow. There's, lots of reference in confidential departmental memos, but also just statements in Parliament where foreign ministers are saying, Moscow is becoming the responsible communist actor, whereas Beijing, they're the reckless ones. They're the ones that are threatening, to unleash a global war with their expansionism, their aggression against India, their expanding influence in Southeast Asia.
And acquisition of nuclear weapons too, of course. Which
happened, incidentally, just a few days before Foreign Minister Paul Hasluck visited Moscow. So by the time he, there have been talks of an Australian foreign minister visiting Moscow for around a year, sort of 1963, 1964 period. Initially, it's supposed to be Sir Garfield Barwick, but literally on the eve of the day he was supposed to depart, he is no longer foreign minister and he takes up a different role and is replaced with Paul Hasluck, who is considered to be much more of a China hawk, if you will. And so there's a few months of build-up, anticipation of his visit. The visit is sort of kicked down the line to October, November 1964. And, China features very prominently in the preparations for this. Hasluck is very, very adamant that, there is a distinct possibility, it might be a remote one, but a possibility nonetheless, that Australia and the Soviet Union could reach some consensus on China whereby, they might cooperate to somehow limit China's influence in Australia's backyard. He's not under any illusions, he knows who he's dealing with. But yeah, there's this sense that maybe we can sort of come to some kind of vague arrangement.
I mean, this is only a year on from the Cuban Missile Crisis too, so it's tense times all round.
Yeah, tensions are high. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as you said, was a couple of years before this. But interestingly, after Cuba, there's a distinct thaw in Soviet-Western relations as, the fallout from the Cuban Missile Crisis ensues. There's this sense that, Jesus, we almost blew ourselves up here. We need to, tone things down a little bit. And it's in this environment that the Australians are approaching the Soviets about China. At the same time, interestingly, President Kennedy, in one of the more bizarre episodes of the Cold War, is approaching Khrushchev, floating this idea of a preventative nuclear strike against China's nuclear facilities to prevent them from attaining the A-bomb, which Khrushchev shoots down quite quickly. That's certainly a bridge too far for the Soviets at this time. But so by the time Hasluck, as I said, visits in 1964, the Chinese have just detonated their first bomb, which could have been considered good timing from the Australians' perspective, given that, this is another opportunity to jump on this China bandwagon and say, look, they've just detonated their bomb. This is crazy. We need to reach some kind of consensus here. Yeah. But again, just a couple of days before Hasluck's visit, another significant event occurs, and that's the unseating of Khrushchev, who was replaced by his former protege, Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev either considers the talks with the Australians either to be too unimportant, or he's just too busy dealing with the political turmoil that's followed.
Probably a bit of both.
Probably a bit of column A, a bit of column B, yeah. But in the end, the Australians only managed to meet with the famous Mr. Niet, as he was known, Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister. You can imagine why he was called Mr. Niet.
Yeah, I can.
Very stubborn negotiator, and As hopeful as the Australians are going into these talks, the Soviets shoot them down pretty quickly. They, Hasluck will say things like, China's, threatening to become the sole, geopolitical actor in Asia. They're staking territorial claims to Southeast Asian territories, to Soviet territory even, to Indian territory. Look at their border clashes with India. Something's got to be done about them. And, the Soviets pretty much stonewall them. They say, we don't agree with everything the Chinese do, but, you're being hysterical. The Chinese aren't imperialists. It's the West's fault that the Chinese decided to detonate a bomb. You've totally mismanaged your relations with them over the last few years, and you've ignored China's interests and, blah, 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 blah.
It's
usual propaganda lines.
It's hypothetical, of course, Jesse, but if Khrushchev had stayed in power, do you think the response might have been different?
It's an interesting thought, and I'm tempted to say yes, just from the point of view of interesting historical hypotheticals and what ifs.
Yes.
My professional gut is telling me that no, probably not. Though I think it's interesting because in the lead up to Hasluck's visit, the Australian desk officer of the Foreign Ministry was very much spurring the Australians on. He's going to an event hosted by the Australian Embassy and getting a bit drunk, and he tells the Australians, we know that you're as concerned about China as we are. We should come to some kind of deal. And he's vague about it, but that very much excites the Australians, and they think, hang on, maybe we might be able to get something out of this.
But you think perhaps he was freelancing a bit beyond his pay grade?
It's unclear. I mean, I would kill to have access to, Russian Foreign Ministry archives, but it'll be a while before I feel safe showing my face on the streets of Moscow. But, I think it is interesting to note that maybe some elements of the Soviet Foreign Ministry were open to at least hearing the Australians out here, but I don't think the Kremlin leadership ever took these approaches terribly seriously. You know, if Khrushchev had stayed in power for an extra, I don't know, month or two, or even if the Australians had managed to meet with Brezhnev, I don't imagine it would have led to too much. You know, Gromyko was quite a senior figure, and I think, you know, he had the confidence, unlike Molotov at this point, had the confidence of his government. I think he was very much speaking on behalf of the big power brokers in the Kremlin at the time.
Yeah. Oh, Jessie, look, a fabulous chapter, such an interesting period of history, and great you were in the archives and did some fantastic original research, and so pleased you were able to participate in the Menzies Early Career Network.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.